If you've been around lately, we've been walking through a series called Faith Steps, beginning with the first steps of belief and bursting through the threshold of doubt and dealing with distractions. And today it seems that it would be a great conversation to have, maybe the most amazing step, in some ways the most difficult step to take, is belief and acceptance of this story of the resurrection. It's so big, it's so great, it's so profound. We recited a little bit from Matthew 28 to begin the service. There was another resurrection that took place shortly after Jesus' resurrection. It was really a prelude to his own. And we're going to read that story in just a moment, and I want you to follow. It's a fairly long story, so bear with us. But John 11 tells the amazing story of the resurrection of one of his best friends, a young man named Lazarus. What we do here every week is we stand for the reading of God's Word, and Lance Phillips is going to be reading for us. Would you stand, if you're able, face the middle of the room for this amazing story of the resurrection of Lazarus?
On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Mary heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever believes by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave where the stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took the stone away. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said for the benefit of the people standing there, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out. His hands and feet were wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go."
Thanks a lot, Lance. You can have a seat. This is that step that's honestly too good to be true, the resurrection. And for the last few weeks of Jesus' life, he was relentless in communicating with the disciples 3 things. He'd be arrested, he'd be crucified, and he would rise from the dead. Let me repeat it. He would be arrested, he'd be crucified, and he'd rise from the dead. Over and over and over again, he communicated, he taught the disciples relentlessly. What's fascinating is they still doubted. They still didn't understand. The gospel writer says he spoke clearly about these things. But whether they didn't get it or didn't believe it, it came to this moment. All the other faith steps we've discussed over the previous weeks involve some form of commitment, a sacrifice, a step of action or obedience. This step This step of belief in the resurrection is simply a natural step that flows out of the others, yet at some point is so great and too great to comprehend, let alone accept. Jesus said to Martha these words, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." And he asked her, "Do you believe this?" And I would ask you today, as unbelievable as it may seem, do you believe this? It's a step too good to be true. And if we've taken the first steps of faith with Jesus, what we understand is this resurrection will provide for every one of us who believes an eternity free of pain, suffering, grief, lived in the presence of God himself, with all those believers who've gone before us and those who will follow us. It's almost too good to be true. It's difficult to wrap words around it. And even today we may be a little slow to accept, cynical to believe that something this amazing is true. You know how it is. It's just too good to be true. 3 weeks ago I got a message, Facebook message from an old friend named Bill in Minneapolis. And Bill asked how my family was doing. We did the normal exchanges, and then he said, "Did you hear about what I won?" And I said, "No, I hadn't heard, Bill." Well, he participated in a process and actually won $15,000 through a government grant program that was dealing with diversity, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, "You won't believe this, but I saw your name on the list as well as one of the possible applicants." And I said, "You're kidding me." He said, "Yeah, all you have to do is contact Karen at this email address, and she'll help you see if you qualify or not." $15,000, folks. And I would have given some to God, I guarantee you. But whatever. And so I begin the process and contact Karen. And Karen came back to me via email and said, "Yes, you have qualified. You're on the list. We know Bill referenced you." And so $15,000 from the government. You know what that means? It means something. It means the deficit grows by 15,000, but hey, nonetheless. And so she said, "All you have to do is send me your personal information. Social Security, yada, 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 yada." Some of you are beating me to the punchline here. You know exactly what it was. And I'm telling you, my heart was beating. You know, I thought $15,000, truly, to give. It was a community grant to do this and that in the community. I would love to do that. And then one of my daughters who was in the room said, "Dad, I think this is a scam." But it's Bill. How could it be a scam? It's a friend from Minneapolis. Well, bottom line is I wasn't born yesterday. I was born 2 days ago. It was too good to be true, and it wasn't. And I think there's a little bit of that doubt and cynicism that even creeps into the corners of our own heart, even though we just stood and celebrated the resurrection of Jesus, the reality that every one of us here as believers in Jesus also one day, someday experiences a resurrection. It's too good to be true. And that's why we're here today. There were many messianic movements in the first century, many self-proclaimed messiahs. Jesus was one of many individuals that proclaimed to be the messianic figure. He wasn't unique at that point. But in literally every case, the wannabe messiahs were crucified by Rome. Again, Jesus was not unique there, but you know where he was unique. On the pages of history, there is no other record of any other first century messianic figure coming back to life except Jesus. It's Jesus. Now, the Lazarus story is honestly a very crucial story for us that blends the reality of our doubts, and we've talked about that faith step where doubt gets in the way. It blends doubts, the story of doubt, with the story of the resurrection of Lazarus. Lazarus is a really good friend of Jesus, and he's really sick, terminally ill. And he lived in a small village right outside of Jerusalem called Bethany. Jesus understood very well Lazarus was seriously sick, and yet took his time traveling to Bethany to see his friend, to bring healing to him. He seemed to be in no hurry, even though death at one point was imminent. Jesus was a little late on the uptake, a little slow on the uptake that day. At least to the relatives of the friend, to Lazarus. Jesus, why are you taking your time to get there? So Jesus and the disciples arrive at the village of Bethany, and he comes so late that Lazarus has died and been in the tomb for 4 days already, which is an important detail given to us by John. The first century coroner would have officially declared him dead. He was not in a coma. He had no deed on NyQuil or anything like that. There was no doubt he was really, really dead. Too much information for you, perhaps. John includes it. He was so dead that there was that odor of death around. If you've ever smelled death, it has a unique stench. And so they arrive at the tomb. Mary and Martha, the sisters, are in full-on grieving mode, and they're grieving no differently from any of us. If you've ever dealt with a sudden death or terminal illness of a family member who's taken early in life, Martha says to Jesus, and I would suggest echoes the words of many of us in our moments of doubt. She said, Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. A moment later, Mary comes up to him and says, Jesus, Rabbi, if you'd been here on time, my brother wouldn't have died. There were others in the crowd. You can hear the murmuring because they knew of the healing power of Jesus, and the people in the crowd were saying, this guy healed people who were blind. He can't heal his friend, and look at this. He let his friend die. And I would suggest, aside from the story, the powerful story of the resurrection, the Lazarus story speaks into the reality of our brokenness. It addresses the significant issue of human tragedy in God's perspective. The ultimate, why, God? Why were you a step slow, 4 days late, in getting there when we need you? You ever ask that question? But Jesus wants to send a message to Mary and to Martha and to every one of us seated here today. As he nears the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus doesn't put on his messianic superhero cape. There's nothing grandiose in his approach to the tomb. This is not Vin Diesel or Clint Eastwood showing up on the scene to weave their magic. The picture of Jesus, if you were listening to Lance's description of the moment, is he gets to the scene and he begins to weep. A few moments later, John writes, he was moved again. There's the picture of God in the flesh, in Jesus. And it's a great reflection of how God walks with us through life. There's compassion, there's brokenness, there's an affinity with suffering. And didn't he have the power to prevent his friend's death? Of course he did, but he doesn't. Because there's a deeper truth at work at that grave as there was at Jesus' grave. And that is, there was a greater plan, a deeper truth that God chooses to orchestrate from time to time through his Son. That's why Easter and even the resurrection is crucial for pushing past our doubts towards the next step of faith. Jesus' resurrection provides us with God's final answer regarding the ultimate perspective of life and death itself. See, we just celebrated together. We clapped, we sang, we're rocking today. You feel the energy, don't you? It's awesome. It's the Resurrection Sunday. But it doesn't negate the reality of the pain we experience in trial, tribulation, or death. But it is in those darkest moments that this moment provides the greatest perspective. We can beat it. We'll walk through it. More importantly, he'll walk through it with us. And the empty tomb is the place we explore and develop that perspective. Don't ever underestimate your presence here today at the empty tomb relative to the issue of doubt over why isn't God at work? Why isn't he working according to my plan? Because the resurrection adds that eternal perspective to our pain and uncertainty. Did the disciples believe in Jesus? Let's talk faith step. Of course they did. They believed in Jesus. But they still doubted the resurrection was possible. Or they would have stood boldly at the cross. Picture the disciples absolutely convinced, absolutely certain that the resurrection was going to take place. Would that have changed their behavior over the past 3 days in the story? Where the disciples are hiding after the crucifixion. Imagine if they really believed in the resurrection. I think they would have been at the cross. That's right, baby. With some attitude. Because you know what we know, say the disciples. He's not going to be there long. He won't be in the grave long. Remember who we're talking about. This is Peter the bold. James and John, the sons of thunder, who definitely would have driven Harleys had they lived in our culture. Go to the tomb for 3 days. And on the third day, Jesus taught plainly he was going to rise from the dead. Imagine the disciples huddling around the tomb. Easter morning. This will be the time. It's just a matter of time. We're in countdown. It's kind of like, it's like New York City on New Year's Eve. They're waiting. They are so assured that Jesus is coming back from the dead. They're hanging out, talking trash with the guards because they're absolutely convinced Jesus will be right. That's not the story of the disciples. They had doubts too. It's somehow comforting today. So Jesus says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And then he asks, do you believe this? So Jesus goes to Lazarus' tomb and shouts, Lazarus, come out. And then he says, take off the grave clothes and let him go. So Lazarus, get this, comes out of the tomb. Slow, halting steps, we don't know. My image of that moment, unfortunately, has been seriously impacted by the movie The Mummy. I can't get past it. It says his feet and his hands were wrapped with linen. There was something over his head. I kind of see this, but I can't quote that, but I just see a scene out of The Mummy. Sorry. It's probably not even close. And what were Lazarus' first words coming out of the tomb? I'd like to say he said, boo! And then, gotcha! But we don't have those details either. But imagine being in that crowd of mourners for days. Mary and Martha, the disciples, picture the emotion of that moment. Paul, the apostle, in 1 Corinthians 15, describes death in this way. He says it's the last enemy to be destroyed. My friends, death is the ultimate enemy. If you've ever faced it, if you're dealing with it as we speak, it is the ultimate enemy. But for Lazarus, and then for Jesus, and then for every one of us who believe and follow him, Jesus declares the enemy has been defeated. You can't kill us. We'll just live on. The ultimate enemy has been defeated, and we've been presented with the gift. It's a gift too good to be true. It's a step of faith too good to be true. I love this story. A few years back, when a letter appeared in the national news that was sent to a deceased person by the Indiana Department of Social Services by mistake. This was the letter that was sent to the deceased. Your food stamps will be stopped effective March of this year because we received notice that you passed away. May God bless you. You may reapply if there is a change in your circumstances. Insert the government joke here, but I'm telling you it's Easter Sunday, and because of Easter Sunday, I can guarantee one thing if you believe, there will be a change in your circumstances when you die. And I can't even imagine, Scripture falls short of explaining the details of eternity in heaven and that final resurrection when the dead in Christ will be raised first. We can only imagine. So Mary Magdalene and the other Mary stood beside the empty tomb of Jesus and listened to an angel tell them, an angel, mind you, who was sitting on the stone itself. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. That story still is transformational. We were sickened Thursday to hear 147 young Kenyan Christians were massacred in the midst of a worship service, perhaps like this one. One of the more recent incarnations of evil, Al-Shabaab, executed them, separated them from the Muslim young adults in the room, and then slaughtered them. It's horrific. It angers us. But on this day, there's something about their death that even inspires our hope. Because for those 147 young Christians, that day was not the end, but only a beginning. And maybe you find yourself at one point, as we all will, next to a graveside of a loved one or friend who truly believed in Jesus. And then in that place, don't deny your pain. Don't deny the grief that you're experiencing. The story doesn't remove that. It just offers a different perspective and a hope in the midst of it. Paul says that's why we don't grieve like others grieve. We grieve with a deep sense of hope. Because we remember in this place on Resurrection Sunday, there's a greater plan and a deeper truth. And it transforms moments like those, like no other. And through the tears and through the pain and the questioning, even as Martha and Mary and the critics in the crowd experienced, they were forced to remember the words of Jesus there. And don't you ever forget these words in places of pain, grief, and suffering. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And he doesn't just make that an academic statement. He makes it personal to Mary and Martha, to you and to me. Do you believe this? I know it's difficult to believe. It's too good to be true. But my prayer for you today on Resurrection Sunday is that you have the assurance that those words offer because of your belief in him. And I'm just saying, if you've never committed to believe and to follow Jesus, Resurrection Day is not a bad time to start. Because he'll transform your life and he'll transform your eternity. And you'll never regret for the rest of your life the decision you made to believe and to follow him. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they'll die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. The question of the day, do you believe this? That's why we're here.